So it's just me in the studio this week, and with no race weekend last weekend, we're doing something a bit different. We're going to do a deep dive into a specific subject, and the subject this week is race strategy. So to make sense of it all, I'm going to introduce you to a couple of really important people at Redbull Racing. One taken from the hustle and bustle of Melbourne a few weeks ago, and the other at Race HQ for the Chinese Grand Prix. Let's wind the clock back a few weeks ago to when I was in a lovely sunny Melbourne, Australia.
Hi, my name's Hannah Schmitz. I am the Principal Strategy Engineer for Oracle Redbull Racing, and I split my time between travelling to the track, sitting on the pit wall and making the strategy decisions, so that'll be when we're going to pit, that kind of thing, and basically trying to come up with how we're going to score the maximum points for the team, versus working in our operations room for the other half of the races, which then helps the person on the pit wall make those decisions.
Now, strategy is a series of decisions about how you race. It's how you manage your tyres, when you take pit stops, and what the weather's doing. Get that right, and you gain speed, possibly positions in a race. Get it wrong, sadly the opposite happens. You're heading backwards. So it really, really matters. How stressful a job is it? Because you always look very calm on the pit wall, whoever's doing that role, and it doesn't feel like it would be a calm situation. Is it all going crazy inside?
I think it's important that you are calm. So it is high pressure, there's a lot of things happening, but you have to be calm in order to kind of make the right decisions and make sure you're trusted and listened to and all those things. So I think it's very important that you are the calm person as the strategist.
And I guess you have to have a confidence or a belief in yourself that you're making the right call, or not be afraid to make the call if it is the wrong one.
Yeah, exactly, you do. So in strategy, a lot of things are a grey area, so there's not a definite right or wrong answer, and you're trying to manage the risk and make the best call based on what you know yourself. So as a team at Redbull, we do discuss a lot between us. It really is a team sport, so we'll be discussing the pros and cons of all the different strategies from before we even get to the track. You have a good idea of what kind of camp different people seem to be in. We're listening to the drivers' opinions as well, and also looking at the data and numbers. So it's not just a numbers game, it's also about opinion and thoughts and experience and gut feel, and it's trying to use all that to kind of come up with the, I guess, lowest risk options. Sometimes, some stages in a season you'll take more risk than others because it depends what the actual aim is at that point. So things do change and develop as you go through a season.
A lot of strategy involves deciding when to pit the car and change the tyres. Inevitably, tyres will wear out during a race, so that means they've got to be changed. And that in turn means a pit stop. In all, that'll take about 30 seconds. Now that's a lot of time in a race that can sometimes be decided by a fraction of a second. Add to that, the rules dictate teams must use 2 different types of tyre in every Grand Prix. So you've got to come in and pit, change those tyres at least once per race. And there are all sorts of different types of tyre for different racetracks. You've got mediums, softs, intermediates, wet, slicks, and they all work differently in different conditions. And you can't always predict what those conditions are going to be. And someone like Hannah is taking all of this info in and making complex decisions very rapidly. Do you expect some tough calls? We've got some crazy weather coming in, and I guess inherently that means more tough calls.
Yes, exactly. So the weather for tomorrow is still a bit uncertain, and that obviously for a strategist makes things a lot less predictable. Also, it's the first race of the season and the compounds have all changed for this year, so the tyre behaviour is also less predictable than usual. And this is a track where we sometimes have graining, sometimes don't, so that also impacts tyre behaviour a lot. Also, the pace of all our competitors, like we try to estimate that as accurately as we can from testing, but there's still unknowns in that as well, and again that's a parameter that really impacts your strategy. So basically there's a lot more unknowns. There are a lot less things that we know, so I think it will be even less certain than usual.
This might seem a stupid question, but do you like the tough weekends, when it's hard in practice because you have to bring out your strengths in what you do?
I like it. I do, as a strategist, you do quite like it when it's close in a race, because then I guess it becomes the strategists racing each other, which can be interesting. It's also good when you're just faster than everyone. And another thing that's interesting for a strategist is being the underdog. So when people aren't expecting you to win, because then you can actually make calls which are a bit different or unusual. And when they pay off, that's kind of maybe when you'd notice a strategist, whereas normally you should just be doing your job and people don't really notice what's going on.
You haven't been the underdog too much, though.
We have have in previous seasons, and we don't know yet this season. Hopefully we won't be. But yeah.
It's a sort of negative question to start with almost, but there must be moments where your strategies haven't been the right one. What's that like, and how do you cope in the aftermath of that?
Yeah, I actually think it's extremely rare to finish a race and be like, I did everything perfectly. I don't think I've ever once thought that. So there's always things that you can do better. Part of that maybe is the type of person I am, and so you're always trying to do better. And I think maybe if you think you're perfect all the time, you should start doing a different job. But that also is just then something to learn from and do better the next time. It feels really horrible if you think you made an actual mistake, because as I said, it's a grey area. Sometimes you're like, oh, I wish I'd gone on that side of a call, but sometimes you do feel like you've made an actual mistake. There's only a couple of times I remember that in my career, and yeah, I still look back on those races and feel a bit disappointed. But then, yeah, strategy is also about moving on. So if you've made a wrong call at one point in a race, you've still got the whole rest of the race to go. So don't dwell on that. Think about what you can do from here and kind of try and have that positive outlook going forwards.
And more positively as a question then, what about the good ones? I know you said you've never been perfect, but when it goes well and you've made a good call that results perhaps even in a race win when you've been P3 at best, how does that feel?
Yeah, that's an amazing feeling. I don't really know how to describe it, but yeah, it feels great. It's always a team game, so it's always everybody's calls coming together, but when you feel like your call has had an impact, yeah, that feels really great. And also sometimes like a relief as well, like, okay, we've won, we've done everything we needed to do.
I wonder also, because this is high stakes, is this the highest stakes when you're before the first race of the season, because there's such an unknown of what might happen?
No, I think the highest stakes is when you're in the tight championship battle. So when it gets to that stage, then the pressure is really there. And I know obviously it shouldn't matter which race it is you're winning at, they all count to the same degree. But when you're in that tight battle, then you kind of feel that pressure a lot more. There's a lot more, I guess, differences of opinion in what you should take risk on and what you shouldn't. So that's definitely the harder point as a strategist. And also being the hunted is the most difficult as a strategist. So if you should be winning, then it can get difficult, because really then you should be doing quite conservative strategies, and that's maybe not naturally what you want to do, because you want to race.
So you're not a naturally conservative person when you approach, that wouldn't be your approach?
Yeah, I think that's fair to say.
And obviously you want to be at the high stakes, at the business end of that. Will Redbull be, if you were to dust off your crystal ball?
Yes, definitely. We're going to be up there this season.
Well, thanks so much for the time. I appreciate it.
No worries. Thank you.
So that was Hannah Schmitz. And what I found interesting about Hannah is while she's the one making the calls on the pit wall for the race, for the strategy for Red Bull, it's quite a collaborative thing. So there's days leading up to it where she'll meet with all various members of the team and talk to those back in the factory. And so while the buck stops with her, she's the ultimate decision maker, there's a lot of people that have been involved in that process. Next up, you'll hear a chat I did at Redbull HQ during the Chinese Grand Prix weekend.
So my name's Will Courtenay. I'm head of race strategy at Oracle Redbull Racing. Basically, my job is to manage the strategy group, and then I attend half the races, sitting on the pit wall, looking after the race strategy, and the other half the races, I'm back in our operations room, providing strategy support to the trackside team.
So how different is it? I mean, you're doing a similar role here as you would do trackside. I appreciate you're not at the race, but it is similar, except a sort of slightly removed role, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. It's a slightly different focus when we're back here in the ops room. Here, it's much more looking at sort of the data in more detail, doing various bits of analysis on tyre performance, pace, various sort of other aspects that affect the strategy, and then feeding that back to the team at the track. So in this case, Hannah's on the pit wall doing the strategy this weekend. So we'll provide her with information, recommendations, suggestions, that kind of thing. She'll take that on board with all the other information at the track and ultimately try and make the best strategy decisions that she can.
Is it some ways helpful, your role then, to be, if you're removed, it sort of gives another pair of eyes, a sort of, is that the kind of sense to it also?
Yeah, I think that is true. When we're in the operations room, you do have that slightly sort of step back, so it's a slightly different mindset. Like, for instance, here we have all the onboard video feeds for all the drivers. We can hear a lot more of the other driver radios because we're perhaps not quite so at the coalface. we can take on more information and try and process that and cut it down and really provide Hannah and the team at the track with the really specific bits of information they actually need in amongst all the sort of noise and data that we have.
So kind of less is more. You sort of pipe up or get involved when you spot something you actually think is really necessary. Is it that kind of approach?
Yeah, I think it is sort of two things. There's an ongoing sort of communication throughout the race. So we'll be discussing ideas, suggestions, the data, what we're kind of analysing, that kind of thing. So that's sort of ongoing throughout. But also we'll be looking at more detail about, is there an opportunity perhaps that might have been missed by the team at the track, or we might put forward a suggestion. So we'll pipe up, as you say, with those kind of moments to say, actually, we thought about doing this. Is it worth trying a 2-stop or a 3-stop or something like that? And we've got a bit more time and capacity maybe to look at those sort of different options. And if we do spot an opportunity, we can raise that with the trackside team.
So talk about this weekend, because the hours are ridiculous. So we're sitting here. I don't think I've done an interview earlier than this at 5:30 in the morning. It's got to be a first for me and probably a first for you. But talk to me about how your week's been, because with the sprint race, this is a particularly crazy weekend. So you have been on English time to a point and then you shift to China time, or how's it work?
Yeah, so, well, this fortnight has been quite tough because we were in the operations room for Australia last week as well. So we obviously shifted hours for Australia, so we were coming in close to midnight and then working through until sort of late morning, if you like. And then for the few days between the Australia event and China event, we've more or less sort of stayed more towards the China time, because you don't want to shift all the way back to UK time to then have to shift all the way back again for China. So Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday this week, we've been coming in at 4 or 5 in the morning, going home sort of mid-afternoon. It's all a bit odd. For China, then we're shifting back. So we were in 3 o'clock-ish this morning. Yesterday was even earlier. We were closer to midnight because the Saturday running starts a lot earlier in the day. So, it's quite grueling working these funny hours, getting up in the middle of the night. You don't see your family or your friends for 2 weeks, which is quite tough. So I think we're all looking forward to this weekend being finishes and getting back to slightly more normal routine.
I was going to ask that, with kids and stuff, do they recognise who you are? Do you just sort of pass momentarily, sort of as you're a zombie heading to sleep, or they're getting up, or whatever's going on?
Well, yeah, I mean, I've got a couple of kids, and the last few days I haven't seen them at all because I've been going to bed before then. Or they find it's hilarious that, I get home and they've just got back from school and I say, right, Daddy's going to bed now. And they're like, what? You can't be going to bed yet. It's still daytime. I'm like, yep. So for them, I think they find it crazy, the sort of hours we've been doing. But fortunately, my wife's very good at trying to keep them quiet in the evening so they don't wake me up. And then when I get up in the morning, I'm creeping around the house trying not to wake them up. So, it's very odd.
It's the less glamorous side of Formula One, isn't it?
Yes, it's not all glamour, I have to say. But, it's an important part of the job. And obviously, we do our best to do what we can to support the team at the track.
And then from this one, are you then doing the triple header away? Is that the next 3 races you'll do Japan and the 2 Middle East ones, or? So
how we try to break it up so that it's not one person doing all 3, because that's quite hard work. So I'm off to Japan and Hannah will be back here in the ops room. And then she's attending Bahrain and then I'm going back out to Saudi Arabia. So, we try and break it up that way because then it makes it easier on all of us. Otherwise it's quite relentless if you're doing race after race after race. So when I'm in Japan, Hannah can be preparing for Bahrain. When she's in Bahrain, I'll be preparing for Saudi Arabia. So it just sort of evens out the workload a little bit more.
So I guess you and Hannah are never in the same room at the same time, or infrequently, probably, isn't it? Yeah,
absolutely. So it's very, very rare that Hannah and I will be at the track at the same time. So this year we'll never be at the track at the same time. So obviously we see each other in the office between races, and we'll catch up then and talk about work and all the rest of it. But yeah, during a race weekend, we'll only ever see each other virtually, either on a Teams meeting or on the TV.
But you have to be very in tune to each other, I guess, because you're doing the same role, shared roles. So you have to sort of get each other, have to have that shared approach. I guess that takes time to gel.
Yeah, well, Hannah and I have worked together for a very long time now. I mean, I think it must be at least 10 years that we've been working together. So I think, we always find that our thoughts are very much aligned and we're always on the same kind of page. So I'll say, I was thinking of doing this, and Hannah will say, yeah, that's what I had in mind too. And so I think that's happened quite naturally because we've been working together for such a long time, and I think that's very helpful for us.
So can I talk about, I guess maybe comparing races? What was the strategy for Australia? Because that was bonkers as a race and ever evolving. This one, perhaps, in theory, with the weather, looks a bit less stressful for China.
Yeah, so with Australia, obviously a wet race pretty much all the way through. You always have a dry plan going to the race, but we could see that there was going to be a lot of rain around, so we always knew that it was unlikely that a dry race would unfold, and sure enough, it wasn't. So when it is wet like that, it's much more about reacting to circumstances, reacting to when the rain comes, how the track's drying out, and just sort of being on your toes and ready to hopefully do the right thing at the right time, which is always a very tricky thing to do. Putting a lot of faith in the weather radar and what that says is going to happen, what the feedback from the drivers is, and there's always a certain amount of guesswork and taking chances. So races like that, it's pretty chaotic, and it's very hard to be precise about it because there's so many uncertainties. For China, though, as you say, the weather forecast looks dry, fairly sunny. So in theory, it should be a much more standard race. And we had to
say that, though.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, all it takes is one safety car at an odd time, and it completely changes the complexion of things. But we had the sprint yesterday, so we've had a bit of a sort of dress rehearsal, if you like, for what we might expect in the race. But still, there's quite a few unknowns. The track's been fully resurfaced for this year, so that always makes quite a bit of uncertainty in terms of how the tyres are going to perform, and it's still not really clear how the strategy is going to pan out. We're likely to use the hard tyre today, and that's going to be the first time that we've used the C2 this year in anger. So again, we don't really know how that tyre is going to perform in comparison to the medium. So there's still a lot of unknowns going into the race. We've got our best guess in terms of what we think the strategy will be, but we'll still have to be proactive and react to things as they unfold during the race.
Obviously, bearing in mind this is going out afterwards, so you're able to talk about today's strategy and what the rough plan is going into the race.
So I think what I need to do is do 3 different versions of this, and then you can just publish whenever is right. So, I mean, at the moment, as we're sat here, our default plan is a 2-stop race. We saw there was fairly high degradation during the sprint, quite a lot of graining on the tyres. So if that pans out similarly in the race, then again, we're looking, say, at a 2-stop. But we also saw last year quite a few races where the track had been resurfaced. We all expected it to be a 2-stop race, and actually the 1-stop became a possibility. It was quite unexpected. So we're open-minded about the fact if things do calm down, the tyres improve, or maybe the hard tyre is a lot better than we expect, then the 1-stop suddenly could come into play. On the other hand, it's not totally impossible that we could try a 3-stop today. We saw the deg was pretty high. We're going to have higher fuel loads at the start of the race compared to the sprint. So a safety car at the right time, suddenly we could be looking at a 3-stop. So we really do have to be so open-minded going to the race in terms of what we're going to do. We've got our default plan, and we've got some what-if scenarios, so we kind of know if the deg's high or the deg's lower, what we'll do. But until we actually get going in the race, it's hard to be sure.
And is tyre degradation the big thing? Because it seems to be that the McLarens, perhaps the perception is they seem to be a bit kinder to the tyres. So is that the concern for you guys, how you'll fare as it heats up and the race gets going laps? Yeah,
so in Australia, the McLarens were very good on that intermediate tyre in the second half of the first stint. Obviously, that the Inter is quite a different tyre to what we're going to have in the race today. And we saw in the sprint yesterday, there was a lot of talk about graining on the front tyres. And we actually saw that Lando Norris actually probably had some of the worst front graining in the sprint. But then what we saw was quite unusual, is that you have this graining on the front tyres, the performance drops away. But then as that graining cleans up, actually the performance comes coming back again. So different people were kind of gaining and losing performance at different points in the sprint. So I think Lando was perhaps struggling more early in the sprint, but then his pace came back towards the end of the sprint, whereas Max actually had quite good front graining. But then he had the sort of the worser graining, if you like, later in the sprint. So he was struggling more at the end of the sprint as others were cleaning up, and then they were coming back at him. So we kind of saw this sort of ebb and flow of pace through the sprint. And it's going to be interesting to see whether that's a feature again in the race today.
So what would be deemed sufficient outcome for today's race? If you were to pack up from here today, what would be a success?
I think it's always hard to judge that because so much is dependent on the pace of the car. So, I mean, we might finish fourth and be really happy with that result because actually we were under loads of pressure from the Ferraris behind and we've done a great job to fend them off for the whole race. Or we might finish fourth and be disappointed with that because the pace was there in the car and we could have been on the podium. So, I mean, I think ultimately we want a good race. We want to try and beat the McLarens. They seem like the best car at the moment. So if we can do that, great. But otherwise, it's just realistically trying to get as many points as we can out of today, given the package that we've got at the moment.
Brilliant. Well, thanks for the time. I think it's time for some breakfast for you before the race starts, but hope it all goes well. Not breakfast, the race, I mean.
Yeah, well, both. I'm looking forward to breakfast. I'm looking forward to the race. So
Brilliant.
Thanks very much.
Thanks a lot. Now, it's fair to say Will's something of a Nostradamus there, predicting fourth place for Max Verstappen. Maybe he knew all along. One take I kind of had from chatting to Will and experiencing the race with Will is how calm he was and everyone else was. I picked his sort of brains on that afterwards, and he was interesting, and he said, well, actually, we've got a reputation of being pretty calm, and it's not the case with other teams. Now, I don't know who he was inferring there, but it's just interesting that listening into a race radio, perhaps of a Red Bull, might not be the same as a Ferrari or a McLaren or a Mercedes even. And it's interesting how you come to being a strategist. So if you're wondering the kind of pathway to that, essentially they are all engineers, race strategists. That's how they begin. That's their backstory. But quite a lot of them have a heavy leaning in mathematics because there's so much artificial intelligence modeling. So they run all these statistics through their model to get them to where they want to be for their strategy for a race. Now, the next race on the F1 calendar is the Japanese Grand Prix on Sunday, April the 6th. Now, Rick and I will both be back in the studio together and laughing at each other's predictions gone wrong. Just to stress, there are no stupid questions on this podcast, so get yours in by emailing to theinsidetrack@bbc.com. And who knows, in time we may dedicate an entire episode to one of your questions. You can follow the show on Instagram and TikTok and watch us on YouTube. Now, the links are all in the show notes. The Inside Track is funded and made by BBC Studios, a commercial company that's wholly owned by the BBC. It's produced by Nick Thompson. Video editing and social media is by Georgina Revel. James Cook is the executive producer.